Good morning. We're in week 10 of our study of Moses and the Exodus. It'll last a total of 12 weeks, so I guess we should be done. I think the 19th is the last day. So we've got a long ways to go. We're in the context of Israel's journey to the Promised Land. I am recording. My Holy Spirit reminded me to record. And this is the route. The blue route, of course, takes us from slavery to Sinai. And we've been spending almost all our time there, and that's what we will do. From Sinai, next week, we will go up to Kadesh Barnea and explore out the land and then be condemned to 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And then after that, there's the final push up around Moab and into the eastern side of the Jordan Valley. Not many people realize that part of the Promised Land where the tribes of Reuben and Gad settled were east of Jordan, not to the west where we traditionally think of Canaan. But anyway, this blue section is where we've spent our time. We saw that it included the major events that are most important to us: the humiliation of Pharaoh and all his earthly power, and all earthly power in general, the deliverance of God's people through the Red Sea, and then the arrival and the year that they spent at Sinai. And that's what we want to spend our time talking about today. This is a Google Earth picture of Jebel al-Lawz. Remember, we went over that and gave us a feeling that, well, we know that Sinai is in Midian. It's not on the Sinai Peninsula. So where is the mountain of God? And the most likely characteristics belong to Jebel al-Lawz. And there's quite a few people that would agree with that. We went through Rephidim last week, where there's the great split rock that gave us water. Jethro visited, reunited Moses' family, and helped him organize. And then they had the great battle with Amalek. And after that, they proceeded on. John, would you read Exodus 19, 1-2?
On the first day of the third month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day, they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain.
Okay, that would mean this side of the mountain here, as you can see, Israel's camp. The peak is right here. The split rock in Rephidim is over here. There's really not that many miles from one side to the other, but if you try to trace the dry riverbeds that they would have had to walk through, it's almost 50 miles away. So it's quite a way. And, you know, we said that the water that came from that rock was such a gushing river like the seas that I wonder if maybe it produced a large lake, and they may have left their livestock and some farm personnel and things like that over there. And then they would have had to have a caravan service that traveled the 50 miles from time to time. Now, the majority of the people settled right here at Israel's camp, what we would call a tent city, perhaps, 1.5 million of them. And they stayed there for 1 full year. And that year was momentous, probably the most momentous in all of Israel's history. It's just filled with incredible activity. And at the completion of the year, almost to the day, they would begin their trek up to the Promised Land. Now, we're going to follow the text for the first two events primarily, which we'll go over in a minute. And I'll be showing you some pictures that had been taken around Jebel al-Lawz that just seem to give us evidence that that may well be the place where Israel camped for a year and where God delivered the law. It corresponds quite well. But I do want you to keep in mind some limitations. And I want to make sure you understand this is a tentative thing. This is a satellite image that you're looking at. And what that is a mosaic of two-dimensional photos stretched on a satellite terrain map that gives elevations. And it can introduce things that aren't there and miss things that are. So you've got to look at these things as a rather general view of it. And you have to remember that Jebel al-Lawz is the highest peak in the area, known as Midian, and therefore it's the best candidate for the likely location of Mount Sinai, but we don't know. I think it's a very good fit. I personally would put my money on that. But you got to remember that it has been sealed off, at least since 1985. And there's a military radar installation on one of the ridges, and the you can go to the Split Rock and Rephidim, but you cannot get into the Israeli camp. That's been sealed off, and we'll show some pictures of that. Obviously, the Saudis are Muslim, and they don't want Jews or Christians doing on-site archaeological work related to the central event of Jewish national history. I mean, I can understand why they would do that. Also, the sources of the picture are a little bit iffy, okay? So I want to be upfront with you on that. The first person to really think of the crossing as being the Gulf of Aqaba and identifying Nuweiba Beach was a guy by the name of Ron Wyatt, and he has a checkered history, but he's a devout believer. He spent 40 years and about 100 trips to the Middle East tracking down confirmations of the Bible. He's an amateur archaeologist, and some of the things that he's involved with were a little goofy, but he was the guy that identified Nuweiba Beach, and he discovered the pillar that we saw there, and he had went over there twice. In 1980, he went there. He slipped over the border illegally because you couldn't get a visa, and he went and he took some pictures and so forth, and then he was captured and he was held for 75 days, and he came home with nothing. He went again in 95 with a Saudi permission and some members of the Saudi Board of Antiquities. They gathered some information, then confiscated it, sealed the place up, and sent him out. That's what his widow testifies. And so really, Wyatt only has what he can remember, and he is now dead. There were others, a guy named Jim Caldwell, and this wonderfully interesting lady over here. Her name is Vivica Pontem, and she's from Sweden, and she was a teacher over there. So both Caldwell and Pontem were living in Saudi Arabia and doing work, and they managed to sneak onto the site, take some pictures, and give them to Wyatt. The third person over here is, his name is Dr. Leonard Muller. He's from Sweden. I think he's the connection with Vivica, and he was asked to evaluate the information, and he wrote this very interesting book called The Exodus Case, and you can get that online. I think it's a fascinating book to look at and read. A lot of good pictures. A lot of the pictures I have that came through Wyatt and his friends come from him. And then you've got an independent guy by the name of Bob Kornicki. Bob Kornicki is an adventurer and archaeologist, amateur, trying to confirm things in the Bible, very much media savvy. He's been on National Geographic specials and so forth, written some books and some movies, and he actually went in under false pretenses, got a visa under false pretenses, and managed to get in there. And before he was kicked out, he took a bunch of pictures and videos. And so that's what we have. Now, just reasons for caution. Some of the things these guys are associated with seem a little far out and incredible. They're like, they are looking for Noah's Ark, and they're looking for the Ark of the Covenant, and things like that. So that's a little bit far out for me. There's conflicts among them about who should get royalties and credits and things like that. And so now money's involved, so who knows? And you got to remember that nobody else has been able to access the site. The Saudis won't let you on there, and so nobody can evaluate the finds that they claim to have photoed. And it also may be that the Saudis destroyed some of the evidences that they may have found in 1985, and so we really don't know if there's anything there. Now, I'd like to think that there's going to be, further research done, but I personally doubt it. So that's what it is. I don't know that these things are fake. I don't know that they're not perfectly genuine and sincere and all that. So when we look at all this stuff that I'll get into a little bit later, I just want you to think of them as possible evidences of Israel's time at the mountain, and then just use them as tools to help you visualize what it might have been like when those things happened. These are the events of year number 1, all right? And I provided you with a handout that came with your invitation, and I would recommend that you print that out and take a look at it. It has a lot of detail, and it has references, because all of these events, they aren't presented in simple chronological order in Exodus. I mean, you gather them from Numbers, Deuteronomy, other books of the Old Testament to bring together and get a complete picture of what happened. But this is the best I could do to assemble that whole year together, and I think that's pretty fair. Give you an idea, most people don't understand that Israel didn't go to the mountain, and then Moses went up, got the 10 Commandments, came down, then went up, got them again, and came down. That was it. He made at least probably 6 trips up the mountain in one form or another. And the Bible text tells us that he spent 40 days, twice at least, maybe 3 times, and during which he had no food and no water. So this is a far more interesting year than I think we realize. Now, we don't have the time in this series to go through all 10 of these events. And so we're going to focus today on 1 and 2, which are really a single item, and they constitute what I might call the marriage of the nation of Israel to Yahweh or Jehovah or to God in a covenant ceremony that is very, very full of meaning and very, very majestic. And it's always referred to in the Old and New Testaments as the Great Assembly. And you'll see why that is as we go on. Let's start out with the invitation to covenant. Now, Exodus chapter 19, by the way, we're going to be in 19 and 20, so you might want to turn there. But Exodus 19 begins with the phrase in chapter 1 that Moses went up to God. Now, they have arrived at the mountain. They've set up their city, their camp. You know, your family lives on Scorpion Street or whatever. And they're organized, and they're now going to meet with God. And Moses goes up the mountain. There's no fire. There's no smoke. There's none of that stuff that we always think of. And where did he go? I would imagine he might well have gone up to the spot where he had met God at the burning bush. And then God speaks to him in chapter 19, verses 3 to 6. John, would you get that for us?
Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites."
So God now has laid before them an opportunity or an invitation to be very specially related to him by covenant, to become a special nation. And this is the foundation of the notion that Jews are the chosen people. We hear that all the time. God brought them to himself, and he said, I carried you here on eagle's wings. I brought you to myself. Now, if you will keep a covenant with me, you will become precious to me above all the other nations. This comes straight out of God's word. They're a special nation. They have a special mission. They're a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So as priests, they have the job of bringing the written and the living word of God to the world. And this they do in the Bible and in the person of Jesus Christ. We owe both of those things completely to Jewry. Even the New Testament was all written by Jews. Jesus himself, the Son of God, was a Jew. So they had a very special mission, and they were separate. They were a holy nation. Now, we all know that, and I just want to add something that kind of amazes me, and that is the fact that God would invite the people he has chosen into this relationship. I think an invitation implies you can turn them down. That's amazing. You know, there's coming a day, the New Testament tells us, when every knee shall bow and every tongue confess, whether they believe or not, that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. But it's not today. That is not true today. God doesn't coerce anybody to come to him. We invite people on his behalf as his ambassadors to come to him. I think this is one of the main reasons that wherever Christian civilization is, it places a real emphasis on the freedom of conscience, the freedom of religion, you might say, and individual choice. We appeal to the individual to come to Christ. Jesus said, go into all the world and preach the good news. He doesn't say go into all the world and kill the infidel. He doesn't say go into all the world and subject everybody to the rule of God. He doesn't do any of that. Instead, he says, come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. It is amazing to me that the creator of the entire universe, the one who flung the galaxies out into outer space, would condescend to address little bitty people on this little pale blue dot that we're all familiar with in the midst of a teeny solar system in a moderately sized galaxy in the middle of billions of other galaxies in space. And he would invite them to come to him and enter a relationship. It's more than just being subjected to him, but rather to be related to him. No other deity given among men does this. Deities are either demand of us or they ignore us. You know, the deist's deity got us started and he's off and on his way. Has no interest whatsoever in us. Pantheistic deities have no interest in us. This is a God who is personal and he seeks a relationship. So Moses goes down, it says, and he relays the information to the people, and so they give an answer. Chapter 19, verse 8. John?
The people all responded together, we will do everything the Lord has said. So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord.
Okay. Think of this as the engagement. God has given them an invitation. Would you enter into this covenant? Will you marry me, sort of so to speak? And they have said, yes, we will. But that's not the marriage. That's not the covenant. That begins to bring them into the ceremony. And so God gives them in verses 10 to 15, he says, go to the people, consecrate them today, tomorrow, and on the third day, be ready. Because on that day, the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. So he's saying, look, you got 2 days to get ready. And later it says they are to wash, they are to abstain from sexual activity. And then it says something very interesting in chapter 19, verse 12, set boundaries around the mountain. John?
Put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, be careful that you do not approach the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain will be put to death.
Wow. Whoever touches the mountain will be put to death. They're to be stoned or shot with arrows, not a hand to lay on. Don't even touch the person that touches the mountain. No person or animal shall be permitted to live. That's really amazing. Why? Ask yourself why. Well, I think it's to emphasize the first and most important thing we are to remember, that God is holy. What does holiness mean? You got to ask yourself that one. If we were together, I'd probably ask for a bunch of people to tell me, what do you think holiness is all about? Well, I think that it boiled down to its essence. It means total separateness from sin. And sin is anything that is contrary to the perfect and wonderful will of God. So the idea is God is so holy and so perfect that it takes one single act of defiance in the garden with Adam and Eve to separate mankind forever from him. God is separate. There is absolutely no tolerance for sin in God, which of course leaves us in trouble. And it reminds us that God is not man and man is not God. We need separation. We need boundaries. We need to recognize the fact that God is God and we are not him. So very interesting, Koernke, when he was over there, he claimed that he's found a number of markers, little piles of rock that were very evenly spaced. See this pile right here? Here's a closer view of it. Kind of a mess now, but it's been 3,500 years. And those piles are evenly spaced around the base of the mountain at about 400 yards apart. Leonard Miller, in his book, says that they discovered some stones at the base of the mountain with this shoe-like inscription. And what you see there is a sandal and the thongs are untied. And that's apparently a indication common in Egypt that says this is a holy place and you should take off your shoes. And so anyway, they finished getting ready. They set the boundaries. They got the rules figured out. And then we come to day 3. Once the preparations are complete on the 3rd day, that's when all the fireworks that we think of get started to signify a 2-day-long transaction between the Creator and his chosen people. Now, let's read Exodus 19, 16 to 19. John?
On the morning of the 3rd day, there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it with fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him.
Try to put yourself here, okay? They didn't know this was going to happen. Moses said to the elders said to the people, he said, okay, let's all get dressed up. We're going to meet God, and we're going to conduct a covenant ceremony. So I'd like you all to sort of gather at the front of the city as best you can in each of your sections around the mountain, and wait to see what happens. And then the mountain explodes. I mean, there's just this huge fire that descends on it, and the smoke that goes up is everywhere, and it creates a deep darkness. And then in addition to that, the whole mountain is shaking, and it says shaking violently. And then there's this trumpet, which would be, I think, a ram's horn, and it just gets louder and louder and louder. I imagine, especially at the first instant, many people just sort of fell down, and others would have turned and run, and everybody would have been terrified, right? Sure. And by the way, Jebel al-Lawz is not a volcano, so you can't ascribe this to a chance volcanic eruption. But interesting, at the end of that passage, it says, as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. Ooh, I would love to know what Moses said. You try to imagine, but I would imagine he would say, oh, Lord, I've done what you told me. When I was on the mountain here a year or so ago, you told me to go bring the people out of Egypt and bring them first to this mountain to worship you. We're here. What do you want of us? Now, it said God answers, and then it jumps to a number of other things that happened during the course of the 2 days. It's a little confusing, and it ends with bring Aaron and the priests up. Well, that doesn't happen at this time. What he's doing is he's giving you the highlights of the two-day operation. Then he's going to go back and fill in what was happening during there between this moment and when this ceremony ends and Moses climbs the mountain with the elders and leaders of the people, and they have a meal with God. So think of this as sort of the outline, and then God answers. Now, between verses 19 and 20, God delivers the 10 Commandments verbally, out loud. This is not a negotiation, by the way. We're not negotiating a deal with God. God is giving us his terms. He is telling us who he is. You can choose to accept that or to reject it, but this is what he requires. All right? And so I'm not going to go through the 10 Commandments. We're all very familiar with them. You have 4 related to their relationship with God and exclusivity of worshiping God. And then they have 6 related to how they are to live with one another. But he speaks this out loud before all the witnesses from this mountain in an unmistakable way. It's remembered forever. Interestingly, in verses 18 and 19, it says that the people, excuse me, 20, in chapter 20, after the Decalogue, 18 and 19, it says, when the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain and spoke, they trembled with fear. And they stayed at a distance and said to Moses, speak to us yourself and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us or we will die. I can imagine them just plugging their ears. We can't stand this trumpet any longer. It's too loud. As a matter of fact, 40 years later, when they were about to cross the Jordan with Joshua, Moses is at the very end of his life, and he reviews what God had done for them in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And here's what he says about how they felt at this moment. Chapter 5, verses 23 to 27. John?
When you heard the voice out of the darkness while the mountain was ablaze with fire, all the leaders of your tribes and your elders came to me, and you said, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and his majesty, and we have heard his voice from the fire. Today we have seen that a person can live even if God speaks with them. But now, why should we die? This great fire will consume us, and we will die if we hear the voice of the Lord our God any longer. For what mortal has ever heard the voice of the living God speaking out of fire as we have and survived? Go near and listen to all the Lord our God says. Then tell us whatever the Lord our God tells you. We will listen and obey.
By the way, just notice in that chapter, the Lord our God has already begun to be used by them. But you can ask yourself the question, why all the drama, right? Why shake this mountain and blow the top off of it and all that sort of thing? Why should we do all that? And I think there are 4 things to keep in mind. First of all, this display of God is not any indication of God's power per se. I mean, he who created the heavens and the earth, sustains them in existence, who put the galaxies where they are, who lit the sun, who lives eternally, who is outside of time. This shaking a little bitty mountain in Saudi Arabia does not really define the power of God. So you have to understand that it was calibrated to what they could take. But also, I want you to understand, it was calibrated to all they could take. They couldn't take any more. Now, why would God do that? Well, this is the second thing that we have to know about God. He is to be feared. First, he is holy. Now we must understand we are not dealing with a God that we have created. He is not a crutch for us to lean on. He is not a figment of our imagination. He is real. He is powerful. He sustains the universe. And we dare not mess with God. And I think everything in our life has to begin with this. We can draw near, but not until after we have understood the fear of God. I must fear God. I must recognize he is serious. He has something to be dealt with. He's something and someone to be dealt with. I must fear his judgment. I must fear what he could do to me. I must fear everything that is this display of power. It begins with that. And then he can invite me into a relationship and provide a way for me. But outside of that, I need to fear him. That's the first thing. Second thing, I think he needed to make it indisputably clear that the creator of heaven and earth was present. I mean, it wasn't just to scare the people and get them to where they feared God. Yeah, that's true. But it was to make it very clear to everybody that this is not your garden God, your garden variety God. You know, they were familiar with the gods of the pagans. In fact, many of them probably had Egyptian gods in their home. And those gods are, you know, perched up on the mantle in the living room. And when they fall down, they've got to be picked up. And when they break, you've got to get the super glue out and you've got to put the head back on and put it back up there. That's the gods that they were used to and believed represented forces of nature. But here's the God who oversees and produces the forces of nature. This is the God who is way above anything we can conceive of. This God of Israel is a different matter altogether. And this is one thing that has differentiated Israel from all the nations of the earth, is one of the reasons they are separate. They have a different conception of God. A.W. Tozer, in his book on the attributes of God, he made a very important statement. He said, no people can rise above its conception of God. We can go to Romans chapter 1, where it says in verses 22 and 23 and 25, he says, although, talking about men who disregard the God of heaven, he said, although they claimed themselves to be wise, they became fools. And they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. So, we worship men today. We worship ourselves. And we worship birds and trees and animals and reptiles because we're beginning to get to the point where we worship the environment. And what he says about that is that they exchange the truth of God for a lie, and they worship and serve created things rather than the Creator, who is forever to be praised. And we're doing that, I think, as a people. The Christian West is forgetting that we serve the Creator of heaven and earth. And he is far more glorified than the environment or any other thing that we might choose to worship. You know, Kyle's message this morning at church talked about idolatry and our idolatries. And this is to make it clear that this God is far above all gods. Thirdly, God's voice spoke clearly to over 1 million witnesses. Over 1 million witnesses. There was no fakery. There was no magic to this. These people had no doubt in their minds that this had happened. This was something where they were witnesses. You remember when Paul was talking to Agrippa about the things that Jesus said and did and the fact that he rose from the dead. He said, look, this wasn't done in a corner. And the God who has revealed himself in the Bible has done so in events with people that lived and took place in time and space on this earth. You can't divorce the truth of God from these things. So he spoke to 1 million witnesses. In Deuteronomy chapter 5 again, Moses reminds the people of this. Verses 3 and 4, John.
It was not with our ancestors that the Lord made this covenant, but with us, with all of us who are alive and here today. The Lord spoke to you face to face out of the fire on the mountain.
Just want to remind you, Moses said, don't forget, it's been 40 years, but you guys were there. You remember, you saw, you heard, you experienced this covenant message, God speaking out of the fire, and you didn't make a covenant with some mystical force or some hidden being. You made a covenant with the living God who was there that you heard. And God, I think, wanted to impress on their minds and hearts forever this truth. It would be recited and sung in their assemblies. It would be written down and preserved in their histories and in their documents and their stories. And for ages to come, it would be remembered by the Jewish people and so be a witness to the world. And to this day, it is. To this day, the most important events of Jewish history took place at Sinai, and the Jewish people still remind us of that. They still hold festivals about what God has done for them. So it's a matter of the testimony of millions of witnesses who saw. Then there's one other reason. In Exodus 19, verse 9, John,
the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud, so the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you. And Moses told the Lord what the people had said.
All right, so Moses' authority to speak for God was also to be authenticated. God told him, he said, I'm going to come down, I'm going to make a big racket, I am going to impress on everybody the fact that I speak through you. As it says there in chapter 19, that it says that Moses spoke to God and God answered him. Now, if you speak to a flaming mountain with a voice that's deafening, or to a voice that's deafening, and it answers you, you've got a lot of credibility. And so as a result of that, these people were able to say to Moses, look, we just can't take this anymore. We fear God. We know we are dealing with the creator of the universe. We are witnesses of this, but we would prefer if you asked him to speak to you and you come speak to us. And that authenticates the work of Moses, which you and I get when we read the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, there's nothing in this world, nothing in history that compares with this self-revelation of the living creator God. And you have to ask yourself a question. Does it make any difference that this really, really happened? Well, of course it does. Dr. Moeller, in his book, Words Out of the Fire, he made the point that this answers the great crisis of epistemology. Now, that's a big word, but all it means is, how do you know what you know? How do you know what's true? If God spoke in this way, in time and space, to real people, and he conveyed this message, we can know. We can know who God is. We can know what to expect from him. We can know what he expects from us. And we can know that it's the truth. If it didn't happen, if it's a legend, if it's a story somebody made up, then all we're left with is mere opinion. My opinion versus your opinion versus some theologian's opinion or somebody else's opinion. And we're loose on a sea of relativism, which is where we are today as a people. If this really happened, then we can know. Not only that, can we know that God has spoken, we can also know that he has given us a law that we must obey. And I think that's the nub. Modern man does not want to be told what he has to obey. He just doesn't want to have God give any requirements on him. I remember when Robert DeHaan used to go on the streets of New York, and he played the microphone, roving microphone, and he would ask people questions, and most of the time questions were answered pretty inarticulately. But he got one guy going to school, probably one of the universities there, and he just said, look, if I could prove to you that what Jesus claimed to be, what the Bible claims to be, and he rose from the dead and all that, if I could prove to you that that was true, beyond a shadow of a doubt, would you bow down and worship him? And it was fun to listen to that man. He squirmed and he squeezed to move away from the question. He tried to avoid it, and he tried everything he could. And finally, when it was all over and DeHaan kept pressing the question, he said, well, no. And DeHaan said, well, why? He said, I guess I just don't want to bow down to any God. I just guess I don't want any God telling me what to do. And that's really the crux of our problem, isn't it? And of course, that's one of the main reasons that men today deny the historicity of this event. Anyway, they're terrified. All the drama has good reason. And then at the people's behest, Moses goes up into the darkness, it says in verse 21. And he's going to obtain from God, remember, we're on the same day here, the terms of the covenant to which they would bind themselves. And these terms are oftentimes termed the law and is presented to us in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. But before I get on to the rest of the ceremony, I want to talk about this concept of the law, because that gets confusing to a lot of people. The law that was given to Israel and is codified in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy contains 3 types of law. The first, of course, is the moral law, the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. All right. These were the 10 Commandments spoken from the fire to all the people. And rightly, we would assume these are the most important elements of God's revelation of himself. And it's really the fundamental expression of the righteousness that God expects of all men. Now, it's not all the righteousness that could be expected of men, but it is the fundamental expression of the righteousness God expects of you and me. And all through the Bible, this is really important. All through the Bible, it is the standard by which men are condemned. It is not the way that men are reconciled to God. It is not the way that men earn the favor of God or earn eternal life. It is the one thing that God uses over and over again to condemn men and identify the fact that we fall short of God's glory because we are sinners. Now, why just 10? That's pretty simple. Well, the answer to that is that God doesn't need more than 10. There isn't a single man alive that God could not condemn with those 10 rules. So whenever the question comes up of my righteousness, do my good deeds outweigh my bad deeds? The answer is no. Nobody has kept the 10 commandments perfectly. In fact, if we could keep all 10 commandments perfectly, we would still be sinners. There's none righteous, no, not one. There's a whole lot more to the righteousness of God than those 10 commandments, but 10 is more than enough. And it can identify to us our problem. Remember the rich young ruler, when Jesus spoke to him, and he comes to Jesus, he says, Jesus, Liz, what good things must I do to inherit eternal life? Well, Jesus turns to him and he says, well, you know the answer to that. Just go keep the commandments. He said, you know what they are? And he rips off the last 6. He says, honor your father and mother, don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't bear false witness, and don't covet. And he looks looks at Jesus. He said, but which ones? Excuse me. Before Jesus ripped them off, he said, which ones? And Jesus told him. And then he smiled and he said, I've done that ever since I was a little child. I've kept all those. Now, of course he hadn't. But Jesus didn't declare him righteous. Jesus didn't even argue with him. He said, well, one thing you lack. Go sell all that you have, give it to the poor, and come follow me. Our righteousness is not going to come from keeping the 10 commandments. It is the 10 commandments that God uses as a very, very simple elementary lesson to teach us that we are sinners and we are lost. And these commands are binding upon all men at all times.
Bart, we have a question.
What's the question?
The question is, did Moses speak the 10 commandments or God? And then maybe a little more dialogue about chapter 19, chapter 19, verse 9. This is verse 9, but I think maybe it possibly meant verse 19, when God and Moses are speaking together, maybe a little more opinion about that conversation.
Well, verse 19 in chapter 19 says, Moses spoke, and as we said earlier, he probably said, here we are, as you requested, what do you want? And then God answered him. And right after 19, between 19 and 20, you will get in the next chapter, chapter 20, he speaks from the mountain and he speaks the 10 commandments. Did I not make that clear? I think I should have.
Yeah, well, and then I guess going back to verse 9, it does say that, God was speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear, and addressing Moses and speaking to him so that they would know that Moses had the credibility, which you did address that issue earlier, but that was just a question that came up, and hopefully that has answered the question.
I think what creates a little bit of confusion is that this section in chapter 19, really, it's an outline of everything that's going to happen over the 2 days. It begins with this assembly before the mountain where God speaks the 10 commandments out loud, and then it ends the next day when all of the elders go up on the mountain and have a covenant meal with God after they have ratified the covenant. And you'll see that when we get to the second day. Okay, and then he goes back, he backtracks in Exodus 20, and he says, this is what God said. And he talks about all the things that happen in between. So you're getting an overview in chapter 19 of what's happened, and then you're getting the details out of chapters 20. And then he goes up to the mountain into the darkness, and there's more given in 21 to 23. But we'll get to that in just a second. However,
Excellent.
what I'm trying to get on is that the moral law is binding on all men. God expects all of us to be that way. And should we fail the moral law as we do, then we are sinners and we are duly condemned. So that puts us all on level ground before God. But secondly, even though the moral law is too perfect for us to keep, and none of us keeps it perfectly, to the extent that we do, it is a recipe for flourishing. Blessed is the God, as the people whose God is the Lord. Those who worship God, have no other gods before him, they're blessed. Those who keep their families intact and don't commit adultery have blessed families. Those who don't bear false witness will have better relations with their neighbors, and a society that's marked by that will be a better place. If you want to flourish as human beings, keep the 10 commandments, which I think is why it is so significant that we have ripped those 10 commandments off the school walls. And we are embarking on an experiment to see if men can flourish outside of the 10 commandments. I don't think they can. Secondly, there are civil laws. And if Moses now is told to go, the people say, go speak to God and come back to us. So he goes into the darkness. We don't think he goes to the top of the mountain, but he goes into the darkness, and God speaks to him for chapters 20, 17 and following all the way to chapter 23. And he gives them a lot of civil laws. Now, these civil laws were a framework for a civil society. They're political. They're not political laws binding on any other nations, okay? And in fact, these laws would undoubtedly be modified and adapted to new and different situations. Once they leave the migratory caravan and they begin to occupy the new land, there will be other laws, different ways to enforce them and so forth. But even though that's true, they still express things that God considers righteous for any nation. Now, there are some people that say we should keep the laws of the Old Testament that apply to the nation of Israel, all the civil laws, the laws of punishment and so forth. Then there's the other side of the coin where some people say, well, you know, that was just for Israel and we don't need to obey those laws at all. Well, it may be true that in our country, we don't have Jews' laws, but we have laws that actually reflect the expression of God's righteousness. It's a good template of principles for law for any nation. Let's give you an example. We're in the midst of this LGBTQ revolution, the moral revolution is going on all around us. Look, we may not have sodomy laws in this country anymore. Certainly not the laws that Israel had, where the punishment was stoning. But God has said in those laws that for a man to lie with a man is wrong. It is wrong for him then, it's wrong for him today. So although the civil laws apply to the nation and they're mostly political and involved in organizing a civil society, they do in many cases express things that God considers good and evil. And we should pay attention to that. And then thirdly, there are the religious laws, what you can eat, what you can't eat, how you go to sacrifice, how you build the tabernacle, and all that stuff. That's designed for the nation of Israel to give them a peculiar religious approach to God that separates them from everybody else. And that's been true throughout history. It takes the sacrificial system that's been present from Adam all the way to this day, and it elaborates on it in a way that points much, much more specifically to the fulfillment of the redemption by the sacrifice of the Messiah, the Son of God. Remember, the animal that was sacrificed gave his life to cover my sins, but he does not forgive my sins. Only when an adequate substitute comes and gives his life for me am I forgiven, and that's Jesus. So these laws, religious laws, most of them are binding upon Israel until Christ returns, until Christ fulfills it, and then there's changes. I hope that gives you some understanding of the concept of the laws that are present in the Torah. So let's go back to the assembly. Now, Moses goes into this thick darkness, and there it is, beginning in chapter 20, all the way to 23, outline what he received as he went up the mountain. Now, what he gets from God is an overview of religious and civil law. There's going to be more later, but he gives him, I think it's the Cliff Notes. He gives him instructions on building an altar with uncut stones and so forth. And there's a whole message in that. Civil laws, servants, torts, property, social responsibility, the Sabbath, the 3 annual festivals, all that stuff is given in a very, very short time. And he ends it with a promise that they will have the land. God has given them the land of Canaan, and a warning not to be seduced by their gods. That is, in a nutshell, what God gives Moses on this first day. He's up there in the afternoon. He's in the darkness. He's received this, okay? And that's the sampling of the terms that God is going to govern them with. And more detail would be coming in the future. So let's read chapter 24, verses 3 to 4, just the first half of 4. John?
When Moses went and told the people all the Lord's words and laws, they responded with one voice, "Everything the Lord has said, we will do." Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said.
Okay, so we're at the end of the day. God has spoken from the mountain and the fire, the 10 commandments. The people have been terrified. They've said, Moses, you go talk to the Lord and we'll come back to us. We don't think we can handle this. He goes into the darkness. He receives additional details about the laws, the civil, the religious laws, and the moral laws that God has given. And he comes back, and that night he writes it all down. And he tells the people, that's 4a. We got, he wrote down everything the Lord said. The people have said when he told them about it, they said, we're still on board. This is kind of like when you're taking your daughter down the aisle before you walk through the doors into the church, you say, this is your last chance. You still want to do this? And Israel said, yes, we do. And so Moses goes to his tent and he writes it all down in a book called the Book of the Covenant. Okay? I think that probably that book is the earliest form of the book we know as Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is actually written in an ancient form of a treaty. They call it a treaty of suzerainty between a lord and his suzerain or his vassal. And so this may be where all that was written down at first. So now the first day is over, and we're going to head into the second day, and that's described in 24. Finish verse 4 and go to 11.
He got up early the next morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as fellowship offerings to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in bowls, and the other half he splashed against the altar. He then took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. They responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." Moses then took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." Moses and Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up and saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was something like a pavement made of lapis lazuli, as bright blue as the sky. But God did not raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites. They saw God and they ate and drank.
Okay, this is the ceremony. This is the big covenant marriage. Early in the morning, he constructs the altar God has said, but he also erects 12 pillars, or had somebody erect them. That wasn't in God's instructions, but he did it anyway. And then he has sacrifices. And notice he says burnt offerings, which are sacrifices of atonement for sin, and fellowship offerings made on the altar. You see, you must deal with your sin before you can have fellowship with God. And then he divides the blood. I think this was interesting, from these sacrifices into two halves. And he splashes one half on the altar. And you'll see in a minute, he sprinkles or splashes the other half on the people. That kind of makes you think about the ancient custom of doing a covenant. Len has taught about this many, many times. An example, in Abraham's covenant with God, although it was a one-sided covenant, nonetheless, the custom was to take the animals and cut them in half, put them on the two sides, and let the blood come down the middle. In the same way, he's divided the blood of these sacrifices in two halves. He puts one half on the altar that binds God, and the other half on the people, and that binds the people. You know, Moses reads the book of the covenant, and they vote yes. That's the I do. You take this man to be your husband, I do. And then Moses sprinkles the blood, saying, this is the blood of the covenant. Now, there is no more solemn covenant than this kind of a covenant. The blood is a big deal. It makes it serious. You know, even in our culture, when we were little boys, I doubt the girls did this, but when we were little boys, you had a good buddy. And remember, you cut your finger and you mingle the blood. You say, "See, we're blood brothers now." We believed that was an old Indian custom. I don't know if it was or wasn't, but nevertheless, we probably all of us, or most of us, did that at one time or another. Why? Because there isn't in us this idea that blood sanctifies a covenant and it makes it unbreakable. And during the Last Supper, Jesus says to his disciples, he said, this is the same words. This is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for you. And he says, this is my blood, in my blood, this covenant in my blood. So now that's done. You've had the marriage. You said I do. We're done with this. And now Moses and Aaron and the leaders of the people are invited halfway up the mountain, or some portion of the way up, and they see God, and they have a covenant meal. Now, it was very common when a major covenant or treaty was signed, once the deal was done, that you had a feast or you had a covenant meal. We see that today in our own culture in the reception that you have after the wedding. And we're all looking forward to the marriage supper of the Lamb at the end of time. So this is the same sort of thing. The covenant now is sealed. Oh, by the way, they said they see God, and you have these descriptions, and we'd love to go into that. But I would recommend that you take a look at Revelation 4, Ezekiel 1 and 10, and look at the similarities, because it's very, very interesting. Okay? So, covenants sealed. That marks the end of the Great Assembly. Let me just show you a few pictures of the site. This is a Google Earth map of the site. You can see Jebel al-Lawz is right here. And there's a saddle here, and then there's this plateau, this little flat area. Now, see, that's where I would set up the tables. I don't know if they had tables, but that's where we might have the elders of the people all gather together, and they would have this covenant meal with God, and that would seal the deal. Now, this is a picture from that plateau that looks down over what would be the campsite. Israel would be sprawled out in this whole plain, you see, and you can see what looks like a little dry riverbed coming down from the mountain, and this looks to me like it could be a lake. You see that right there? All right. There's also, if you look where the boundary of this river and this lake are, this area I've labeled A, up against the mountain, this would be sort of a restricted area that's separated from the rest of the encampment, and that would be where Moses would have set up the altar and the pillars and so forth. In fact, the remains of the altar that we're going to see in a minute are right down, I think it's right here. It's hard to see. Now, this also is where Moses would have seen the chaos in the camp when he came down to see the Golden Calf Rebellion. And everybody's going crazy out there. There's the political order has been overthrown and needed to be restored. Now, that water that I'm showing, here's an artist's concept of what it might have looked like. You can imagine Moses had his headquarters in here, all right? And that this would be water coming down from the mountain. Now, we all know about Rephidim, where the mountain, the water came out of the rock. But in Deuteronomy 9:21, Moses recalls that after the rebellion, he took that golden calf and he ground it to powder and he threw it into the stream that came down from Mount Horeb. So there was on this side a stream or a river coming down the mountain and could well have supplied them with this water. Now, you could see that the altar is right here. It's right by the stream. And Muller points out what he believes are the site of wells. That's a very interesting thing. I'd love to get some more detail on this, but they are basically dual rows of stones separated by sand that go down quite a bit. They're about 18 feet in diameter, and they would have filtered any water coming in into the center, and you could draw water for cooking and drinking. This is a picture of the ruins of an old altar right there, okay? And it's right next to that river. You can see in this picture, and this is a closer picture of it. And according to Wyatt, the archaeologists and the people from the Antiquities Department did a little cleanup, and this is a picture that they took. And, or Kornicki, when he went, confirmed that, took some pictures. I'm not so sure about this, but down here in a crescent, they found 10 rocks that looked like they were the base of some sort of pillar or monument. And maybe, I'm not so sure, but that's what Muller's book says, and maybe that's the case. It could well have been that they put that up there. Over by the altar, on the other hand, there's a number of pieces of white marble, which is not native to the area, would have had to be carried in, probably wasn't present at the time the Israelites were there, but Kornicki thinks that these are from the 12 pillars. I just don't think they had the means, but nonetheless, Muller believes that these would be kind of a memorial. sort of a thing that might have been erected later on. Remember, we saw the pillars at both sides of the crossing that were kind of memorials. So here could be another one. Maybe this was a memorial shelter or something next to the altar to remind people of what God had done at that time. Just in passing, out in the camp, there's this big platform about 20 feet by 30 feet, which has all these bowls on it and could well be the site of the altar. This is a picture of an Egyptian apis bowl. This is the sort of thing that was on that altar. There's several of them called petroglyphs. And everything's fenced off. And this is what you see. Notice that the sign is also in English. It's the only English sign in the entire province. And so you can get an idea who it's meant for. Basically, it means this is you. This means you. Now, if you put all that together in, from Jebel al-Lawz, you're looking at an encampment site that looks kind of like this, and it helps you to visualize what it might have been like. The yellow, that's the Israelite camp. All the purple dots would be the wells by the lake. The green arc is where they found those pillars, or the basis of those pillars. The pink circle right here, this is where that altar is. You can just see it in the picture. These three dots would be the site of the memorial, and those little pieces of marble. And out here is where that platform is that might have been the altar for the golden calf. We can only wonder if this is the true layout. I don't know if it is, but when I think of all the things that they had to do back then in 3,500 years ago, this helps me to visualize it pretty well. So that's the end of the Great Assembly. And of course, this thing goes on in chapter 24, verse 12. It says, the Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and stay here, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandments I have written for their instruction. This is his first trip up the mountain, where he spent 40 days without food and water. Now, there are two of those trips, and there's a 40 days after the rebellion of intercession, which may also have been on the mountain, during which he also ate no food and water. Reminds you what Jesus said when he said, I have food to eat that you know nothing of. And he does. This is when he saw God's glory and presence pass while he was sheltered in the cleft of the rock. They built the tabernacle, they celebrated the first Passover, and then they had a national census and created an army, and they're off to the promised land. Now, I would just commend to you the handout I sent, that you could maybe read those passages and get a better feel for what happened. The most important thing, though, was this wedding ceremony, this great ceremony of covenant, which is the central event in the history of Israel. And then you might ask, well, what does that mean to me? What do I care? Well, it helps us visualize a lot of things about Israel. But this is that verse back at the beginning that was the preamble to God's invitation to Israel to join him in a covenant relationship. It defines what his intent was for Israel. And it has that beautiful phrase in it, I carried you on eagle's wings. And that reminds us that salvation is of God, not of men. No man can save himself or anybody else. It also reminds us that God must bring us to himself. Jesus said, no one can come unless the Father draws them to me. And it declares what God intended for Israel. It says, if you will keep my covenant, obey me fully, you'll be my treasured possession. An obedient, believing Israel is God's treasure above all nations. They are special. And even unbelieving, unfaithful, disobedient Israel, often referred to as an adulterous wife. Eventually, the Bible tells us through the prophets that she will be regathered, revived, and redeemed. She is a precious treasure to him. And Israel is a priest. He's brought us the word of God and the Son of God. Israel's a holy nation. They are separate. And that's the main reason you see so much anti-Semitism on the rise today. You cannot get away from the fact that God has separated Israel. It's the oldest hatred in the world. They are indeed a separate people. And then as far as my life is concerned, I think a lot of this applies by extension to all the people of God from all ages. We are freely invited, and yet we are drawn divinely into the fellowship of God. I don't understand that. It says, come unto me, all you that labor and heavy laden. Whosoever will may come. That's a legitimate invitation to me. I am invited to covenant. By the same token, he brought me to himself on eagle's wings. It says, no man can come unless the Father draws him. We are saved by grace through faith, and that faith is not of yourselves, it's the gift of God. Do you understand that? I don't. But I believe it's true. And the only way I've been able to visualize it is that there is an archway at the entrance to heaven. And as I approach from the outside, that archway says, whosoever will may come. But once I pass through it and I look back, I see saved from before the foundation of the world. God knows me. He has invited me. He has drawn me to himself. And the intent for Israel is very similar to the intent for his people of all ages. It says, if we obey him, we are treasured above all. If you will be treasured, if you would be cherished of God, then you must obey him. Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. In Isaiah 40, it talks about the shepherd who holds his sheep to his heart. You can't experience that if you're disobedient. You can't know that intimacy if you're out, having run out of the fold. You have to be obedient. And then we are to be representatives of God to the unbelieving world. Go into all the world and preach the gospel. We know that. And then we are both now and in eternity to be a holy people. And I think that's significant today. Very significant today. We are a kingdom within a kingdom. As Augustine said, we are part of the city of God and we dwell in the city of man. The two are diametrically opposed, and we have to have one foot in one and one in the other. But we have to remember that the kingdom of God that we belong to is superior to the kingdom of man. If any of you have read the Manhattan Declaration, it puts it beautifully. And I've read it to you before, but it ends, we will gladly give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but we will give to God the things that are God's. And I think we're going to find that pressure will build on us more and more as time goes on. But we got to remember that we are a kingdom. We are priests to the world, and we are to be a holy nation.